This is TWiT.
And you did pick a nice brown liquor for tonight.
This is one we all know.
Yeah.
You know well,
you introduced me to it.
Did. Although I introduced you back in the day to A'bunadh.
Right.
This is a different version of it. But let's talk a little bit about Aberlour for starters. So this is a Speyside distillery, the original version built in 1825.
Wow.
Although it ran for a few years before James and John Grant moved on to make the Glen Glant distilleries in Rothies literally down the road. And then the distillery was set vacant for a few years until James Fleming reopened it in 1879, where it promptly burned down, as he did back then, because lack of fire controls and using explosive gases like alcohol. So there was a major reconstruction in 1898, which will become interesting a little later on. And then it goes through the usual iterations that most distilleries go through. Sold to a group called W.H. Holt and Sons in 1921. 1945, it went to S. Campbell and Sons. And in 1973, they did a major expansion of the distillery, largely because they were selling a big portion of their production to Dewar's for the blends. And at that time, in 1973, they were putting a new set of stills in. So they excavated in the backside of the still room and found a time capsule from 1898.
Oh my gosh.
It included some of the recipes for how they were making whiskey in 1898, which actually became the inspiration for A'bunadh, which in Gaelic, which I'm terribly mispronouncing, means the original. So there's sort of this idea of, hey, we basically have the recipe from 1898 on how they make whiskey. We should start making that whiskey. It took them a few years to get it up and running. And during that time, Pernod Ricard bought Aberlour and all the other Campbell distilleries. And then eventually we buy Chivas and so forth. Like they're one of the major giants in that space.
Do they change things? I mean, is that a bad thing, or they just...
There's a bunch of things that does happens when you end up in a conglomerate. Like you become parts of blending groups, you do barrel sharing. So the product is affected. But there's still the same stills, right? The for the still, the shape of the lie arm, the way the Ugby works, like all of that stuff more or less stays the same. You don't mess with the stills, but you probably mess with how you buy grain. You probably change how you handle barrels. And often you're dealing with scale issues because you're part of a larger group now and you're probably going to produce more because you get access to more markets.
Right.
Pernod Ricard sells all over the world. And so, things have to expand. Now, the whiskey that you two fell in love with, the Aberlour A'bunadh, is a fantastic whiskey. And I often have it around because it's one of the very few cask strength whiskeys that you can buy off the shelf. Cask strengths are rare. What makes that whiskey distinctive, and Aberlour especially, is that it's aged only in sherry casks.
Mm-hmm.
So they buy Spanish sherry casks, which are expensive and very large, and do long agings. Although if you look at a bottle of A'bunadh, you will notice that it has no age statement on it. It's an NSA bottle. And there's a good reason for that. The whiskey's not that old. You can't age a long time in sherry cask most of the time. It becomes quite strong. Like you won't like the flavors. So the rumor is that it's between 5 and 25-year-old barrelings that they use, but it's mostly 5 to 8-year-olds. And that's young enough that putting the year on it, putting 5 on it wouldn't make anybody happy. So they don't. And let's face it, it tastes good. You liked it. I like it. It's a great whiskey. They do no coloring. All that color comes from the sherry cask. They do no chill filtration. So that's Aberlour A'bunadh. That's where it comes from. And today, the Aberlour distillery has 2 sets of stills. That second set was put in the 1970s. They like stainless steel mash tuns. They use no heat whatsoever. I was delighted to see that they used the Maori cream yeast because you guys love the idea of cream yeast. And they use rack house.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was going to giggle when I mentioned yeast creams. So when I notice it, I'm like, I'll write it down for you guys. And they do rack house aging, which is dirt floors, barrels on their sides, and wooden racks.
Wow.
Classic. So a couple of years ago, they made a new edition of Aberlour A'bunadh.
How did I not know about this?
And it's called the Alba. Now, Alba is a funny word because it's actually a reference. It could be a reference to Quercus alba, aka the American white oak. That is the bourbon cask, because this is a version of A'bunadh made in bourbon casks instead of sherry casks. Alba in Gaelic also means Scotland, so there's a fun little crossover there. But it is a different edition of A'bunadh. Other than that, again, no age declaration on the bottle. Multiple barrelings,
still cask strength.
Still cask strength. So you'll see some places refer to it as being 57.1% alcohol, and that's because the first picture that Aberlour provided of it, that was the strength on it. But I found 62s and 64s, so anywhere between like 55 and 65. They barrel it at about 68. So the fact that it's only down to 62 or 63 means it's probably only 5 or 6 years old. The first editions were released in 2019, specifically for the American market. It is relatively expensive, $85 for a bottle of Alba, if you can find it. It is at Total Wine and Bevmo. They're around, but it is, and its flavor is described as younger.
Yeah, well, it is younger.
Sherry has
actually, okay. I mean, Aberlour A'bunadh is. I'm a little harsh. Does this mean this is harsher?
Yeah, well, let's think about the difference between a sherry cask and a bourbon cask. So for starters, most sherry casks, although modern sherry casks today that Scottish distilleries could buy, are literally made for the purpose of providing to Scottish distilleries. So in the old days, they would make these barrels for export of sherry, and because you bought your sherry in barrels, and then they had the leftover barrels, so they would use them. Today, to limit, they sell in bottles, and so to provide sherry flavorings in the sense of the sherry cask, they do young editions of sherry, typically a 3-year aging in that barrel, and they sell that barrel off, and they take that 3-year-old sherry and they use it for other things. It goes into other barrels. It'll age on further. So you get a certain richness from sherry that's distinct, right? And the barrels are typically used only a few times before they're used up. Bourbon casks are always the same. They're small, they're used once, and they're heavily charred. And so you go in, the American bourbon makers always go into the barrel at 63.5%. So the Scots always go in above that. They'll go in at 64.5, or even in the case of Aberlour, they come in at 67 and 68. It's trying to go cask strength. They're going to lose a little, right? And so it's going to pull different notes out of the wood because it's had a different experience. American barrels are charred. They've only had a 5 or 6 year aging with bourbon in them, so they've only got so much exposure. You're going to get a different flavor profile. I mean, I would argue they're abusing the name. This is a different.
That's what I'm. Yeah, if it was like a sweeter version.
Ironically, it's more expensive than the regular A'bunadh.
Yeah,
I found them within $10 of each other.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
it's not that much different, but I mean I guess the name's appropriate in the sense that they're using the same process, right? That is cask strength. Multiple barrels of multiple ages, and where the original is all sherry, the Alba is all American bourbon. So it's if you look at it as it's a style, it matches the style, but you definitely can tell the difference between a sherry cask version and the bourbon cask.
Sounds like I prefer the regular A'bunadh than the Alba, to be honest.
The problem is this is a first love problem now, Leo.
Yeah, that's true. I'm like a little duckling. I am printed.
No, you're printed.
I did too. I mean, we have this at our house regularly. Like it's there.
Maybe we'll get one of each and have a taste.
Yeah, have a little taste off.
Because I'd be curious. That would be an interesting thing to do, especially for developing your palate. To say, okay, sherry cask, bourbon cask. Can you tell?
Especially when you talk about different styles. The only thing I would say against the Alba, like where the Alba is in trouble, is that we know they use older barrelings of sherry, like 20-year-olds, to round out the flavor, and they're not going to have that for Alba. They haven't had it long enough.
So interesting. However,
Yeah.
if you have not discovered Aberlour in general, you should.
Yeah. They are famous for sherry casking whiskey in the Space Ice style. No peat. Other than
Which
that's
I
sort
like.
of their
I don't like the peaty. So
the 12
Right,
12
exactly.
five.
And that's a
But
trick with Scotch.
yeah.
The A'bunadh is kind of special.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Now you say A'bunadh, it's spelled Bunadh.
Yeah.
But God knows it's Celtic. It could be anything.
Gaelic. So yeah,
It's Gaelic. Okay.
And I mean, I've heard it pronounced by Scottish people. I'm doing my best. impression.
A'bunadh.
A little hock the loogie is
Ach.
somewhere in there,
Ach.
right? And I say it better after I've had like
A'bunadh. A'bunadh. A'bunadh Alba.
Could have three. I know.
It's
Three
great.
would be.
It's great. You drink more of it, laddie. A'bunadh. Don't worry about the name, laddie. It's just.
I'll never forget the day that it must have been like a build event. You and Carl were there, and Mary Jo. We were all sitting at the table at the previous TWiT location, and Leo
right.
was secretly trying to steal the A'bunadh from us.
I loved it.
kind of bring
like
it.
a criminal. He was like just pulling his hand back slowly, like bringing it in.
Hey, I think I brought you guys a 20-year-old barter house too, but you never gave any love to that thing. You got
There were you introduced me to Angel's Envy at that sitting, which I really still like.
Interesting.
I learned a lot about stuff. That's my first experience of cask strength, for sure.
My initial reaction was I said something to the effect of, I feel like I was just shot in the tongue.
I mean, you sunk back in the chair saying, "Oh, this is my jam."
Yeah. I was like, everything else receded.
Hello. Oh, sweet mystery of life, I have found you.